You cannot know what you are capable of doing until you try. They'll come from somewhere. People are just kind of forgetting where they're coming from.
What is the number one thing that you see parents do that really impacts children?
Definitely family violence. It's very dangerous. It's very dangerous to keep trying to live within an abusive relationship.
Do you still feel like there's some sort of discrimination that happens within the justice system?
Well, unfortunately,
conversation reveals what silence has scattered. Most transformative conversations are the ones that are honest, courageous, and beautifully human, across borders, across communities, across generations. Welcome to Fierce Colourful Conversations. This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kamloops-Tishpepmi part of the Shipepnik Nation. We honor the Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands for generations and whose wisdom continues to guide pathways of respect, relationship, and reconciliation.
Hello viewers, it's another episode of Fierce Colourful Conversation and I'm your host Sally Martin. So excited to be joined here by Paula Monaga, a family advocate, community enthusiast, and so much more. Over to you, Paula.
well, hi, Sally.
Hi, thanks for coming to the show.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
So who is Paula?
Well, I am from Colombia originally, and since very young, I feel like I have like a big passion for helping people, and I think that's mostly what moved me to be where I am right now. So I think I'm just like a very passionate, kind, and someone that is into the service of the people. I do work in family law, so I like working with the community and family, and I help them to navigate all the issues related with family law. And yeah, that's what I'm doing right now, but I study law with that idea of helping the people.
Wow. Family, it's a big system.
Yes.
So you wanted to help people and now you're doing family law. How is it practicing in Canada versus practicing in Colombia? I know you mentioned that you had your own practice in Colombia. What does that look like? What's the difference? Are you practicing right now? What does that look like for you?
Yeah. So right now I'm working as an advocate. In Colombia, my title is lawyer, and I did try to create my own firm, but we were in the COVID time, so I was navigating kind of lack of opportunities. There was not enough clients, and my whole team was in general struggling. So I came to Canada, and in family law, it's been a really nice experience. Mostly a very good learning and growing experience, because it has allowed me to learn how the system in Canada works. So, for example, now I'm able to navigate, for example, provincial court, Supreme Court. I know how to manage different family law issues, different concerns. I know where clients can go, and I know how to navigate the acts like the Family Law Act. I know how to find case law. So it's just like an opportunity to grow in law in my career, and that's been a very great experience. It is my hope to keep growing as a family law advocate and eventually as a lawyer, because I'm also trying to be a family law lawyer. But yeah, just lots of opportunities in Canada.
Mm-hmm. And so you came for school. What program did you take again?
Well, initially I studied a master's in business administration and a master's in common law.
Wow. What a transition. And I know because you're following your passion, which is really beautiful, because I know a lot of immigrants come here and, their passion, their dreams just get, swept away or kept under the rug, and they have to take a totally different trajectory career-wise. What keeps you hanging on to that dream? Because I would love to hear that, because a lot of people that are immigrants or newcomers or international students, whatever their pathways are, have to completely reinvent themselves, and you've still maintained your dream. What keeps you hanging on to that?
I think part of it is you cannot know what you are capable of doing until you try. And a lot of people will tell you it is impossible, you have to give up your dream, you cannot continue. So for example, in my case, as a lawyer from a different jurisdiction, they told me, you cannot practice law in Canada. You have to give up to that. You have to study a new career. And I tried that initially, so that's why I tried with business. And people will tell you that. People will tell you just like, it's not possible, it's not possible. So part of it, I think it's more how you talk to yourself, how to motivate yourself, and kind of like stopping those negative comments that will try to give you an idea that you cannot do something, and like take the step and jump into it and try that. So even though I study business, I still apply for legal positions. And for example, my position had different requirements, and people will say, you're losing your time applying for those things. Don't even try it. Just don't listen to those comments.
Follow your heart.
Yeah, try. You never know until you try. And that's what happened to me. I applied and I got it, and it's been great.
Wow. So if people are in medicine, such as doctors, or in, different other professions, maybe engineering, they can still hang on to that dream.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I think the most important is not giving up into what you want to achieve. Just try as much as you can, try different options, but just try. Don't give up to the comments and to the ideas.
I couldn't agree more with you, Paula, and I'm so inspired right now. I'm gonna hang on to that dream. But talking of, law and even immigration right now, there's a lot of tension. How do you feel as an immigrant when you maybe go on social media, or when you see those protests, people actively being anti-immigration? How do you feel it? What's your take on that?
Yeah, when immigrants come to Canada, they have an expectation that the country has given to them, and they have built their dreams and their aspirations, their careers, their different areas of life because of that expectation. So what the government and what the new policy is doing, they are affecting the human rights of the immigrants, and they are not considering that this country is immigrants.
The funny thing is that I see other people there that are being anti-immigrants, and it's so funny how people really forget that they were once immigrants. Some of the frustrations can be valid. I think it's important that there's a structure, so that when people are immigrating here, there's housing, there's, sufficient housing, there's enough employment, or there's enough supports that are actually support these immigrants. But I think some of the hate is definitely very race targeted, but that doesn't eliminate the fact that they once immigrated here, whether it's with their parents or the grandparents, whoever their ancestors are. So, do you feel like there's an imbalance?
I think we all come from somewhere.
Right.
And at this point, I think people are just kind of forgetting where they're coming from. And that's why this idea of entitlement, that I think it's not it's not justified. We are all working together, and it's not fair. It's not fair that at this point of time we want to say that because of the challenges facing, we're just going to blame immigrants and cut immigration. I think it's not right when people from different backgrounds can work together, because they will bring different perspectives, different ideas, so many issues that can be solved. I think love is like the center of society.
Yes, there's definitely a lot of benefits of inclusion, and I wish we could embody that on our day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
Well, I think differences are so beautiful. I mean, think about how boring it would be if we were all the same.
Yeah.
If we all looked the same, if we all acted the same. Sometimes I think about like robots.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think there's just so much strength in our differences.
Yeah.
But maybe we don't look at it that way. Now, as a lawyer, I'm sure these are things that you experience a lot. These are things that you see, practicing family law. There's so much that happens within the family. And, I come to think of it, I go back to families because we raise these people, we raise these monsters, we raise everything that we see, stems from families.
That's so true. Family is the center of society. Everything starts from the family. And it's true, multiple issues that we see today in society, they all started in childhood. Well, children were growing up with parents that were facing different challenges that they didn't know how to address. So all the, I can say, values and principles that children learn from very young age, it all starts within the family. And in family, we can see different concerns and different situations that are hard to address. And when parents don't know how to address those things, and they start, for example, with violence within the houses, within the homes, and the children look at those behaviors and they grow up thinking those behaviors that are normal. Just to give you an example, if that's not addressed, they will continue eventually with those ideas. So that's why it's very important to talk about education and like cultural education values for families, because the children now are the society of the future, and if they are not growing up with good values, what society are we going to have, right?
Totally. So in your experience as a family advocate, what is the number one thing that you see parents do that really impacts children?
Definitely family violence within the homes. It's very, very negative. It has a negative impact on children, and they experience different mental health issues during their childhood. So for example, they start experiencing guilt and anxiety and those negative emotions that parents don't know how to address. Being witnesses of different types of abuse, like physical abuse, physical violence, but also the psychological and the emotional violence, which includes different behaviors like name calling, like for example, a parent calling names the other parent, or like financial abuse, or when they don't have access to resources because of a controlling behavior or coercive behavior, or threats to remove the children, to take them out of the house, or even the country, threats to abduct children. That can create very negative feelings, to the extent that they start being victims of, for example, parental alienation. Like, for example, with parents that are trying to co-parent, but they don't know how to talk to each other, how to communicate to each other, and they start involving children into the legal issue. Like, there might be a point where the children will be just confused about which parent is right, which parent is wrong, which parent to follow. They lose the sight of which parent to obey, because they will say different things. They will have different ideas, and they will talk bad about each other. So that's the ideas that the children are taking and growing up with.
Right. And what do you think is the antidote to all those issues of families?
I think communication and like set up boundaries. Like, for example, if the parents already decided that they are not going to be together, being very specific about how to communicate with each other, like to be respectful with each other, not to involve children into the legal issue. Communication especially, it's a big part of all the issues that end in court, because parents tend to be very general, and it's in those small details where all the issues start. Like, for example, how to exchange the receipts for the expenses, and if the other parent hasn't like go through that process of moving on and like healing, co-parenting is going to be very difficult. And there are different tools and resources for co-parenting, like co-parenting apps, different options. Even in court, parents can request like conduct orders to manage communication, but they also need to be like willing to follow the court orders and willing to communicate, and mostly put in top the best interest of the child. That's like the most important thing. What's best for the children.
So if I think about, especially a lot of separations nowadays, I've seen a trend where parents tend to use the child as the bait almost to impact the other parent. Is that something you've observed, and how can people navigate that and create balance for the wellness of the child?
Yeah, sometimes parents are just very into like the fight after separation, and there are different family issues that they haven't really negotiated and addressed. They will try to take the child like to request sole parenting. And something with family law in court is that court can be very, very intimidating. And parents are also very afraid of losing the children, like losing the love of the children. So it's like a threat to lose love, try to lose the children, that the children will decide to go with the other parent. So it's a constant fight between parents for the children, who has the most time with the children, who is responsible for paying what, and also doing things that are like the purpose of those things is just to harm the other person. Like, for example, deciding to move away the children just to harm the other person, because they are putting the best interest of the children at first, but because they want to harm the other person. And the children are growing up with those things.
Yes, and at the end of the day, these children are going to become adults, and then we breed a society of adults who are very hateful or full of anxiety and just a lot of trauma, basically.
Yeah,
I like
trauma.
what Gabor Mate says, that the environment in which a child grows up really does influence how they become adults, how they show up as adults. And it's so interesting to see it. And now when I think about it, the correlation, and even for those parents, if you look keenly, those parents that can never come to an agreement during separation, there's always, an underlying problem from their pasts as well, growing up or as children, so it's really interesting. We never think about it so keenly like that, but to think when we sit back and reflect, when you see the history and the future, and just how children that are brought up in a lot of, domestic or hostile environments, domestic violence or hostile environments, and their parents as well, and the generation of their parents, you will see a lot of the times that history really tends to repeat itself. And what I really like about Garbamate is how he tries to help people understand themselves, because then that's the only way we can prevent history from repeating itself. But, we're human beings, and sometimes we don't want to look inwards, and because sometimes looking inwards is so painful too. So we're like, I'm never, going that route, So really, really interesting to see how that impacts. But now coming back to immigrants, and I know that one thing that was really important that you mentioned is about people knowing their rights.
Yeah.
Now, I have encountered a lot of immigrants that, will go through domestic violence or some form of abuse, but unfortunately don't know their rights, whether it's employment rights or through family, their own individual rights in a family setting, employment setting, or just in society, basically. What are those rights that people need to know? In family law, what are some of the key things that people need to know when they're in a family, or when they're going through separation, or when they're going through domestic violence?
Yeah, something very important to know, and it's also related with the idea that court is very intimidating, and that they feel that because they are in a different country, in a different jurisdiction, the law will not apply to them, is that regardless of country, religion, culture, where they come from, it doesn't matter for the court. They have the right to apply, and if they need protection from a partner, they have the right to file for a protection order if they meet the test for protection order. There is no requirement of being a resident or being a Canadian. Everyone can apply to get help from the court. And now, in terms of violence and immigration and family law, there are different ways where immigrants can face different types of abuse within their relationship. I do have to say that's more like immigration law, but one of the most common ones that I have seen in the practice is people that fear not getting into the process to become residents. So for example, the sponsorships is when one of the partners started first here in the country, and then they apply to bring the spouse to the country, and that creates some power imbalance, if I could say, some coercion, because now the spouse depends on the person that is already in the country, and that can start lots of abuse and family violence. So coercion, control, threats, harassment, they can experience lots of abuse, and they are in a very difficult position because they cannot leave the relationship without having a very negative impact to their process. It depends on the situation, in the specific circumstance. But for example, if someone that is trying to leave an abusive relationship, that depends on the partner that is doing the sponsorship. If the process, for example, is not complete, the partner might drop the application, and that person might lose all the time, all the money, might need to come back from their home country. But if, for example, and that's when knowing the law plays a very important role. If, for example, the person know that the process is complete and that the person is safe to leave the relationship, then the person could start a process. Of course, it depends on the circumstance, and it's always best to find advice from a lawyer. There are lawyers that are family law and immigration lawyers. Always best to find the advice from a lawyer before taking steps. But for sure, there are different resources, and especially once someone decides to leave an abusive relationship, there are different resources and tools available in the community. Like, for example, they can find free advice, free representation. They can find shelter if they need shelter. Organizations that are in charge of helping people in need, especially like women fleeing from family violence. So they could find a more affordable rent temporarily while they do the transition process, food. The organizations like nonprofit organizations that help with the legal part of the process. They can find just different resources in general. But it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous to keep trying to live within an abusive relationship, because the things with family violence is that it escalates within time. Right. So today it can be name calling, but tomorrow it can be more. It can become physical, and it can become, even the last stage, it can be lethal or mortal.
Right.
For the partner. So it's good to take steps to leave an abusive relationship.
Right, regardless of the status.
Regardless.
Because at the end of the day, your life and your safety are
life
so
is first. Yeah.
I've never thought about it that way, about partners that are sponsoring their partners to come and stay here and then become abusive. But also there's something that is really cultural. I don't know if this is in Colombia or South America. But I know a lot of cultural people, especially in partner relationships, people think that sexual abuse cannot happen. Like rape is not possible because this is my husband or this is my partner. Is that something that you've heard about? And I think it's good that we share, because a lot of immigrants might not know their rights in terms of, consent and just being able to say, this is my partner, but no, tonight, no. Or some people think, I'm your husband, especially people coming from very patriarchal societies. They think, well, I'm your husband. I have the right to your everything.
Yeah. So sexual abuse is actually one of the most, I don't want to say common, but it's one of the most common types of abuse within abusive relationships. And people are very scared to talk about it because, let's say, the system kind of requires to provide evidence. In some situations, it means like to prove the sexual abuse. And it can be very difficult to prove. And we don't want to put the victim in a situation that will make her live again what the person experienced and re-traumatized. It's very tough, but it's definitely very, very hard and very detrimental, but it's very common, the sexual abuse in relationships. And even if it's hard to prove, it does not mean that we are going to say that it didn't happen. And there is something very important about what you said, which is consent. Consent, it's like the main in a relationship, right? Like, it doesn't matter that is your partner and that you have the title. You always need consent from the other. And if you don't have that consent, that's when the abuse starts. And sexual abuse can be even just like touching without the consent of the other. That is sexual abuse. And that is something that the victim can claim and file for protection.
Wow. I just think about people that find themselves in those situations and really difficult, especially for immigrants, and not knowing their rights, not knowing about consent, and coming from these cultural societies that make, especially women, I think women are very disadvantaged because they're always coming from societies that tell them you have to be submissive, whether you like it or not, and your husband, those societies and those dynamics, they say, this is your husband, this is the man,
Yeah.
whatever he asks for, you have to do, or the woman has to. So it's really interesting to see how that can really impact people, especially when they're here and not able to navigate the system and know what their rights are. So.
Yeah, it's very difficult to navigate, but there are different ways to prove if like, of course, if the goal is like to apply into court and start the different legal mechanisms available. For example, some of the ways is like medical reports, because people think that abuse is just physical, but abuse it can be also emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and something like a medical report is very valid and accepted as an evidence of the abuse that one of the partners experienced. So even like keeping journals, keeping messages, in terms of applying into court for some relief, those are evidence that could be very useful. It's not just requirement to have like the picture of this is what happened, but the statement and the medical report,
So what you're saying is that even though there's a lot of burden of proof for the complainant or someone that is filing for that there are still ways that people can navigate that to be able to find justice or get justice.
Yeah, it is not guaranteed.
Right.
It will also depend on the judge. It's not guaranteed that the person will have the outcome that is looking for. But yes, there are different ways to provide evidence of the abuse that the person experienced during their relationship. And it's always better to speak up and talk about those things, because that's another thing that I've seen is that people experience violence. They are very scared of retaliation and scared of consequences, scared of the future, and they don't want to talk about it. Most of them are very, like, they try to minimize what they experienced. So they will say like, oh no, it was just they hit me briefly. Like they won't actually like openly talk about what happened, but once they start explaining the situation and start realizing everything they went through, it's like a life changer, and it's very empowering for them to accept that they are experiencing violence and that they were in an abusive relationship and that the person that they loved or that they thought loved them back was not as good as they thought. It's very empowering. So it's always better to speak up. Always, of course, find the advice of a lawyer before taking any action. And also, if the plan is to leave an abusive relationship, there are different tips and tools that they can use. Like, for example, start planning with like the finances, start separating joint accounts, be close to exits. Yeah. And some organizations can help also with safety planning. That's the word, safety planning, to leave abusive relationship. But yeah, I always encourage people not to stay in abusive relationships regardless of the fear of uncertainty of what will happen after and retaliation. The community is there and they are not alone. They are not the only ones experiencing family violence, and they will have lots of support once they decide to take that step towards the freedom.
Mm-hmm. And do you think justice is always served, or there's fairness in the system? Because I think sometimes, not just even in family law, but there's always been an imbalance, in the justice system. And so a lot of, if we're speaking from immigrants' perspective, they might not feel confident of the system to protect them. Do you feel like there's justice always served, or is it dependent, or do you still feel like there's some sort of discrimination too that happens within the justice system?
Yeah. Well, Unfortunately, there is still lots of room for improvement when it comes to access to justice. There are big barriers to access justice, and the outcomes are not always fair.
I love how safe you are with your words. There's room for improvement.
Yeah, it's that's a tough one.
Yes, there is room for improvement. So basically, that there's not always fairness.
Yeah, I don't know which words to use because it's not a happy ending all the time. So
Right.
for some people they will get it, but for some others, and yeah, like it's not to diminish or to try to say that abuse didn't happen or that the person didn't experience that, but sometimes they require, like for example, the issue with the evidence. There are different types of abuse that are hard to prove, and if the person didn't keep pictures, if the person they are not going into the relationship with that expectation of being abused at some point. So when it comes to applying and having a fair result, it's not always easy. It's still difficult, and yeah, it is true. There is still some. Well, I don't know if some might be the right word, but there is definitely discrimination within courts, and some people facing the same situations might get different results, different decisions. We're just not talking about it. We ignore those things, but discrimination is happening within courts, and not just for access to justice and clients, even for example lawyers. For example, indigenous lawyers could have like a different treatment from like white lawyers, and yeah, that's like discrimination within courts. It's just a very tough area.
And I mean, we do see that even, when you talk about the representation of indigenous and racialized people in the court systems, we definitely see a huge disproportion in that representation in comparison to their population within Canada, So, yeah, wow, I commend you and continue following your passion. You've inspired me tonight to hang on to that dream and believe in it and keep on pursuing and following the heart and what I'm passionate about. Are there other things you would like to share around family law that would be critical for our viewers out there to know?
Like for people interested in practicing law in general, or people navigating family law?
That's a very good question. How about you just take both?
Okay, for people interested in practicing family law and following their dreams in terms of career, my advice would be to believe on their own selves, believe that they can. Don't listen to the negative comments, don't listen to people try to tell them that they can't and tell them that they are not capable or that they don't have the requirements, or just follow what you want and be consistent with that idea, be disciplined with that idea, and from 1,000 of applications, I assure you will get at least one. Just try all shots and you will get one.
That's right, you just gotta keep trying. Now, what about someone that is in a hostile environment right now, that could be an immigrant or is coming here to be with a partner that I don't know if things are going to work out. Just someone really navigating a very complex, dynamic situation in a family setup, whether they're on the verge of separation or have divorced and are still, sometimes the wrangles continue even after the divorce is concluded. What is your advice or what are your recommendations around people navigating that?
Yeah, well, I would like them to know that they are not alone. That's the first thing. People get very isolated with their issues and they close in their heads, but a lot of people are facing similar situations, not the same because every situation is different. But if you decide to take that step out of an abusive relationship or in a hostile environment, I'm sure that you will find the community support and the resources available for them to help them out of that situation. And just take the step and have the courage to speak about what is happening and to reach out for help.
Wonderful. Well, viewers, listeners, you heard it all. You are very close and keep holding onto that dream. That's the inspiration I got today. If you have a passion, whether you're a doctor, immigrant, whether you're a lawyer, whatever it is you're practicing, don't lose your trade. Keep on to it. Unless you just want to change careers. Well, we're here again. I've been your host, Paula Martin, and joined by wonderful Paula Monica. Until next time, this is Via's Colourful Conversation.